Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, his mercy endures forever. Welcome back to another episode of Faith Matters with Philip Campbell. We are a Catholic variety program broadcasting on Good Shepherd Catholic Radio out here in the paradise of Jackson, Michigan. I am the aforementioned Philip Campbell, your host and the voice on the other end of the radio for the next half hour. I'm very happy that you've chosen once again to tune into another episode of Faith Matters. Now, just last year in 2019, the church got a new saint, and I'm referring to St. John Henry Newman. John Henry Newman began his life as an Anglican clergyman, but through the study of the history of the church and theology, converted to Catholicism towards the middle of his life, later became the most eminent Catholic clergyman and thinker in Great Britain, and a cardinal. He died in 1890, and just recently been canonized. Today, to talk about the thought and the legacy of St. John Henry Newman, I have with me my old pal, Dr. Ron Muller. Dr. Muller is a retired professor of Ave Maria College and lecturer at Western Michigan University on matters philosophical. Dr. Muller, welcome back to the program.
Well, thank you, Philip. It's always fun to be here.
So I remember reading. Newman. I read him as well when I was in college. When I was learning about the faith, he's such a brilliant thinker, brilliant scholar. There's so much we could say about him. But I guess first, I'd like to ask, how did Newman become a saint? What was his contributions to the church?
Yes, well, that's just a marvelous story, and it begins when he was born into a middle-class British family there in England, where actually his mother was a Congregationalist, and she seems to have inspired him, imbued in him and the rest of the family a spirit of evangelical Christianity, which we find, I think, perfected in his later life and writings and development. It's an interesting time when we look historically at the situation of Catholics in England, because after the Reformation, of course, it was no longer possible to be a Catholic in good stead. You were a second-class citizen at best. If you went to university, if you were involved in government, whatever, it was necessary to subscribe to the Anglican religion. And so when Newman then went on to university, because he had great gifts as a promising student, he went when he was typically like other Englishmen of the day, 16, 17, or 18. He went to Oxford and there had to subscribe to the Anglican doctrines regarding Christianity and the Anglican Church of England and its religious views. And this was necessary to be a student at Oxford. In those days, the faculty lived in the colleges. The students still would go to mandatory religious events, the chapel, the high table. It was a very regimented view that was not that different from the way it had emerged in the medieval period, namely that students and faculty were considered kind of third-order religious. And so in those days, then, he learned very much his Christianity. He was a scholar, and he learned theology very well and became a minister or a priest in the Anglican tradition.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't realize how regimented Anglicanism was back then. They were told what to preach on every weekend of the year. Sure. They had a little schedule they went through annually saying on this Sunday you preach about this, and it was a very regimented religion. But speaking of the penalties against Catholics in England, in 1829 we have the Catholic Relief Act, which basically does away with most of the old Reformation-era penal laws. And then that allows something starts happening at Oxford and in the Anglican world after the lifting of the sanctions against Catholics.
From the viewpoint of many of the traditionalist Anglicans now, who had established the Church of England and we could call and understand to be high Anglicans, that development was a weakening of the Anglican faith and tradition. The high church tradition did not look at this kind of accommodation with Catholics and other Christian denominations, the Baptist, the Anabaptist, the Congregationalist, etc. This was just considered at this time to be a loosening of the bonds of Anglicanism.
Right.
And I just mentioned that because as he settled into Oxford and then grew more serious as a scholar and a teacher and a don, and of course, again, being an Anglican clergyman. Newman joined a group called the Tractarians, who then, and this is another reason for why we look to his religiosity, his love of God, and faithful witness to Christianity, we see that he entered this movement in order to re-energize Anglican faith and practice.
Right, he did it to support Anglicanism in an era when many thought it was coming apart.
Yes, when it was not what maybe it would be ideally.
So
Now,
how is his religiosity reflected through his involvement with the Tractarians? I guess, what was this movement and how did this
yeah,
kind of
well,
influence
the
it?
idea was to, and it's called the Tractarian movement because they published various tracts, short pamphlets on matters of religious faith, and there were several in the group who took this ideal of re-energizing the faithful in the Anglican circles very seriously. And it was there that Newman contributed some really wonderful thoughts about the importance of religion generally. Now, the plot thickens, though, Philip, because part of the Anglican tradition was the contention when it came time to try to justify why we're Anglicans rather than Romans or another tradition. The Anglican tradition had embraced this idea that it was the true successor of the Apostolic Church in the sense that the church founded by Christ in its real spirit, etc., had come down through the early centuries only to have Rome, as it were, intercede and hijack the real spirit of Christ's church expressed through the apostles. And that when Henry VIII and the Reformation had come up to England, it was the Anglicans that were going back to the real spirit, or the genuine meaning, so to speak, of Christianity.
And they would have thought that, on the other hand, the Lutherans and the Calvinists and the Puritans had thrown too much out.
Correct. That the Anglican was like the true vein of Christianity coming forward.
They had a phrase called the Via Media.
The
Middle
middle
way,
way,
yeah.
yes. And it was certainly not Rome. It was not the Roman Church. And then it was maybe then split among Anglicans themselves between the high church types, the real traditionalists, and then the low church Anglicans, who were more of a Protestant Reformation spirit.
Yeah.
It's just that as Newman dedicated himself to the study of this idea, he really turned to a serious reflection on the church fathers and the early church. It became more and more difficult for him to accept this contention that the Anglicans were the true vein or the right way of Christian understanding. And it was through this that he came to raise many difficulties and see many problems with what were called the 39 Articles of Anglicanism. Now, those attempted to summarize what it really meant, kind of an Anglican creed to be an Anglican, and those in politics and government and in university positions and things like that all had to subscribe to the 39 Articles.
If I recall, his magnum opus in his Anglican period where he came to all his conclusions was an exhaustive study of the Arian controversy.
Sure, yeah. And it was through those studies that he saw that it was not Anglicanism but the Roman Church itself that had truly remained faithful to the Spirit of Christ. Now, this was becoming quite problematic because he was rising in the Anglican hierarchy there at the university and in Oxford to the point that he became the high rector of the University Church of St. Mary the Virgin, which was the top of the line for Anglican clergy, when then the whole issue of his conscience and what he could subscribe to and what its public influence would be came to the fore. And so
During this time, was he accused of being a crypto-Catholic or
a sympathizer or a papist sympathizer.
did he have to deal with that?
Yes, or it was becoming apparent that he had certain sentiments that way until finally then he did convert to the church and retire quite dramatically from his position in Oxford. His longstanding friends parted company with him. It was quite traumatic personally. And he simply retired to a small town south of Oxford there called Littlemore, where he spent the next 3 or 4 years writing, contemplating, and studying.
Now, this conversion, he wasn't just some clergyman. This would be the equivalent of someone
Yes.
here like Cardinal Dolan, or someone
Yes.
just abandoned the church and converted
Surely.
some other. So
Yes,
this was a
it was
massive
major.
shakeup in Anglicanism.
And especially because of his reputation and stature as a scholar and a thinker. And his beautiful sermons from this period, which are collected in a work called Plain and Parochial Sermons, show that true vein of Christian religiosity, I think. It really shows why and how he believed in God, he trusted in God, he had the spirit that I think all of us Christians should emulate.
Now, tell me about, as he starts developing his thought during the Catholic phase of his life, how he developed his opposition to liberalism in religion, or the role that liberalism played in his thought.
Well, this was part of it, because liberalism is the idea that somehow all religious traditions mean well or equally valid ways to God. And that, of course, this was a part of the whole context there in England with the different Protestant denominations and also, abroad. And it was here then that he saw the truth, which is that liberalism like this is false and misleading, and that there was no other way or via media that you could pursue that would be equally valid with subscribing to the church.
Yeah. So when did he convert? 1850s?
43, I think,
43.
is where it is, but I'm not sure that that's precisely the date. It's
Middle
just
of the century. So
yes, it was.
this puts him during the pontificate of Blessed Pius IX, who was the 19th century's most stalwart opponent of liberal movements within the
Yes.
church and in society. And Newman would find himself theologically on the side of Pius in these controversies, yes?
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yes. What impresses me is the fact that it was such a monumental personal decision to give up everything at Oxford and then go convert to the church. But once he got into the church, it wasn't like suddenly everyone was celebrating his life and his conversion, that the church just felt, well, here's another Anglican that came over. And he wrote a lot of things, but he was nothing special. So Newman then even had difficulty first being ordained as a Catholic priest, and then he became a member of the Oratorians of St. Philip Neri. But then they just assigned him to a prep school situation in Birmingham, where he was just now a parish priest.
As they'd say today, it was definitely not a lateral promotion. He went down.
Yeah. But that's what I think is so fascinating, again, back to the same theme, that his contribution to us is showing us the importance of faithful witness to the truth that leads to Christ Church in Rome. And it was here then that the very interesting development occurred, that the Irish bishops had been given finally permission to found the first Irish Catholic university, with the English dominating Ireland for the whole century, for the tradition going back. You could not go to Trinity College in Dublin if you were a Catholic, because you had to subscribe again to Anglicanism and the 39 Articles to get in the university.
Right.
But by the early 50s, there had been a movement to liberalize that. And among other things, now it looked like it was going to be possible to found the first Catholic university in Ireland. Monsignor Archbishop Cullen invited Newman then to come and be the first rector of the great Catholic university because of his academic stature and background. And this was where then I think he undoubtedly thought that his life's work would be spent in molding the ideal university where Catholicism and the love of truth and all things work together like this.
He wrote a very famous essay on the ideal of a Catholic university.
The idea of a university.
Yeah.
It, in fact, is a collection of some 10 or 12 lectures that he gave in the development phase of the university. And the challenge was a new challenge for him, and one that I find terribly fascinating, which was of trying to articulate the principles of a stellar, ideal learning institution and what that meant. Now, from his Oxford days and all of his studies, he really gained a great respect for serious scholarship in the humanities, but then also in the technical fields of the sciences, for example, that he came to see and understand the university as a place where representatives from all the areas or fields of knowledge would come together and have marvelous discussions on what is true, and then establish for the good of society and culture their conclusions on, cosmic issues, that philosophy and theology and literature and history and all the rest would work hand in hand. That was the ideal that he took to Ireland. But the interesting thing is that the Irish bishops seem to have had a different view. And that's because of what I've told you, I think, before, which is the bishops are interested in saving souls, not discovering lots of new truths.
Yeah.
And it was amazing to learn the history, as I've done recently, that Monsignor Connell, the Archbishop, was quite cavalier of not even corresponding with Newman, who was supposed to be the rector of the new university. That he wrote asking, well, what are the next steps? What can we do and not do? And the Monsignor just ignored him, thinking that his mission, the Archbishop's mission, was to found the new Catholic university according to the directives of Rome. Now,
So how long did Newman stick it out there?
well, it was 5 years that he was there. But then at the end of that time, there was a real problem because the Archbishop had been so cavalier as to appoint Newman's secondary deputy rector or vice rector, whatever, and not even tell him. And so it was like when Newman wrote letters asking about the direction of the school, he was just treated maybe as an afterthought. And that was really disturbing for me to understand that bit
Sounds
of history.
personal.
Yeah, it does. And so after 5 years, he resigned as rector, and the project really never came to fruition, even though subsequently later down through the years there was a new Catholic university that was eventually proposed.
Sure. Now, in Newman's conversion, which went on for years of study before he finally resigned his Anglican position, he developed very insightful ideas about the nature of conscience, man's obligation to conscience, what it means to assent to a religious truth. And he wrote a very wonderful work about this subject called The Grammar of Assent. It's one of his more famous works. Can you talk about that?
Well, this is why his writings and insights and teaching about these things became subsequently so influential on the church during the time leading up to Vatican II. And it's where those probing thoughts on the nature of conscience, for example, find their place and echo in the personalism of John Paul, for example. But essentially, as we see from this history, then Newman came to understand that truth is not, as it were, just notions that we have, but it has this ordination towards setting up in our hearts, of being personal to us in such a way that we embrace it, well, as the existentialists would say, with a fullness of our inwardness, like with Kierkegaard. And this is where Newman explored that difference in the grammar of assent between a kind of theoretical assent to the truth that is different from the real assent that happens in a personal commitment like that.
Faith is a very personal act.
Yes, it's not just an intellectual conclusion like
It's not just what side of the line am I stepping on intellectually.
yes,
It's a very
or it's not like, a conclusion in geometry where you see that it follows from the premises.
right.
It really has to be embraced with the full passion of the soul and the spirit, which is what we know about Christianity.
Right. What was the illative sense that he spoke of?
Well, that's that sense
That's that sense.
that we understand, we intuit how these truths are not just something we give a notional affirmation, in our minds, but rather that they are personal and that we have to assent to them in that inwardness of our hearts and our ultimate commitment.
They have a real claim on our will.
Yes, exactly. They're a claim on us about what we do.
His other most famous work is probably the essay on the development of Christian doctrine, which I've read many times, and it's thoroughly underlined every single page. Can you speak to his
Sure.
thought
Well,
on this essay?
that's just another one of his marvelous contributions, and it's where, in the study of going back to the church fathers and those earlier things we talked about, Newman came to see that revelation came to us through Christ and is not having more things disclosed or revealed to us down through the centuries. That his life and witness is like the fullness of revelation is there for mankind. But nevertheless, Newman saw that it's such a rich and deep well of meaning that down through the ages we can understand doctrines and see them in greater fullness and see them develop, or see through our own reflection and experience the way in which the articles of faith and the doctrines have an ever greater richness in understanding how they apply to our period in time, say.
Right, because the dilemma was essentially this. You have the liberals saying that religious faith can change, that well, we used to believe this, but now
we believe that.
Now we accept this is okay, and Catholics would argue absolutely not. But at the same time, if you look back at Catholic history, clearly the Apostolic Church looks very different than the Church in 18th century Europe. So clearly Catholicism has changed. So I think the dilemma that Newman's trying to answer is, in what sense do things develop but not actually change in their substance?
That's right. Well, that's it. The substance is the same, but the meaning is so rich that we can mine it, as it were, for even greater and greater insights. Yeah.
And that's almost verbatim the ideal that John the 23rd had when he summoned the Second Vatican Council. His famous announcement that what was the exact quote? That the substance of the faith never changes, but the means in which we present it changes through time.
And that's one of Newman's great contributions that, as I said, influenced heavily the spirit of Vatican II.
Now, Newman eventually ascends to the cardinalate. Do you know when that happened?
How that came about? I think that was Leo XIII made him a cardinal. And it was an acknowledgement of such a long, wonderful life of Christian witness and serious commitment in the illative sense.
So if you had to sum up, just point to, just give us a summary, the major reason why Newman is a saint, what we can take away from him today.
Well, that's what I would say, that he is so exemplary because he shows us that holiness is possible through good thinking, or that it's possible to, in incorporating truth and living in the truth and being about truth intellectually, that we see that God is pleased by the way in which the intellect can come to know him and understand things in a beautiful way. And this is what I think is one reason why Newman is so important for the church, meaning for all of us Catholics, is that holiness is possible through learning.
What an admirable example for today. Now, last question, there's a little thought experiment. Let's say through some miracle we can bring John Henry Newman back today, and we take him out for a trip and we visit somewhere like UCLA or one of these West Coast universities or somewhere like that. What would his opinion of higher education be in the United States today?
Well, I think that the very first thing he would ask is whether or not theology is present in the curriculum, you see. Because in the idea of a university, it makes it so clear that you can't have a true body that's devoted to learning successfully if you systematically exclude the theological tradition. Now, that doesn't mean that theology is the most special discipline in the curriculum, or that it has a certain priority if we're talking about things that go beyond just the religious facts. I mean, if we're talking about society or culture or art or whatever.
But it's a piece in the hierarchy of truth.
But it has to be around the table. Yes.
It'd be like saying I'm going to teach you math, but not division.
Yeah, that's right. or leave out one of the
I'm not going to
major
tell you
sub-
what parentheses mean.
And so is trying to play solitaire with incomplete deck.
Right, right. All right. Well, that's about all the time we have for today. Dr. Muller, it's always a joy seeing you, and thank you so much for educating us on this great new saint.
Thank you, Philip, and I look forward to the next time.
All right. Well, until we meet again, this has been Faith Matters with Philip Campbell. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you. May he be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. God bless you all.